Forensic Science Lecture 16-1, History of Fingerprinting. The early methods of identification, as we discussed in the beginning of the year, was developed by Bertolini, which was known as anthropometry, and this relied on the detailed description of the subject combined with full-length and profile photographs, and then a system of precise body measurements. This was actually used for 2 decades. We can find use of fingerprinting as early as 3,000 years ago, used by the Chinese to sign legal documents. And then in India, an English civil servant required natives to actually sign contracts with the imprint of their right hand. And then in 1880, Scottish physicians suggested that the skin ridges could be important for identification, especially in dealing with the criminal system. In 1892, Francis Galton published a textbook called Fingerprints, and this was the first to propose assigned fingerprint patterns, 3 of them, which we'll discuss later, but loops, arches, and whorls. But once this was developed, the next step was to create a classification system, and the system needed to be capable of filing many thousands of prints in a logical and searchable sequence. In 1891, Juan Vichtic devised a classification system that is still used in most Spanish-speaking countries, which is at the picture at the bottom. And then Sir Edward Henry devised another classification system at the same time. This one is used by most English-speaking countries, including the U.S. It wasn't until the early 20th century where fingerprints were actually readily adopted worldwide. And this is because in 1903, Bertolini's system couldn't distinguish between 2 men. When they went to process a convict, Will West, at the Fort Leavenworth prison, the measurements showed that William West was already incarcerated at the prison. These 2 men could have actually been twins just by looking at them, as well as with their measurements for Bertolini's system. And their pictures are to the right. It wasn't until they used the fingerprints that distinguished them from one another. After this instance, fingerprinting began to be used in earnest in all major U.S. cities. So the use of fingerprints was adopted in New York City first, by civil service commissions in 1901, and then in 1904, at the World's Fair, American police were actually trained by Scotland Yard representatives in how to read fingerprints. By 1924, fingerprint records of the Bureau of Investigation and the Leavenworth prison were merged, which is was the nucleus of what today is the FBI, which has the largest collection of fingerprints in the world. In 1991, the admissibility of fingerprints were actually challenged. After a hearing, the judge ruled that human friction ridges, which are fingerprints, are unique and permanent, and that human friction ridge skin arrangement are unique and permanent to each individual. This ends Lecture 16-1. There's a quiz next class.